Hello and welcome to the Week in Parliament. The Brexit bill clears the Commons and heads for the Lords. Plenty of democratic debate. Not everyone thinks so.
What is it about the procedures of this place that allow a bill of this constitutional significance to be railroaded through in this disgraceful fashion?
The bill goes through unaltered, but there are concessions. A Brexit minister promises that Parliament will get a meaningful vote on the final EU exit deal.
I can confirm that the government will bring forward a motion on the final agreement to be approved by both houses of Parliament before it's concluded.
Also, a little local difficulty for John Bercow after he suggests President Trump is sexist and racist and shouldn't be allowed to make an official address in Westminster Hall. Has the Speaker prompted a campaign to remove him?
Funnily enough, I don't think there was ever not a campaign to get rid of the Speaker. There's been a whole load of Tory MPs, most of them in fact, who would be delighted to see him go.
And message delivered OK, but to a surprise recipient. Did the text that came the Labour leader's way reveal a secret deal on social care?
And is the same sweetheart deal on offer to every council facing the social care crisis created by her government?
But first, joy for the government, joy for Brexit supporters, but problems and high-profile resignations for Labour. The successful passage of the so-called Brexit bill through the Commons produced several moments of turbulence for the political parties. Against expectations, the notification of the EU withdrawal bill was approved by MPs without any alterations. It now goes on to the House of Lords. The bill, imposed on Parliament by the ruling of the Supreme Court, authorises ministers to start the EU departure process. But before the bill left the Commons, there were key issues to debate. Issues such as the rights of EU nationals working and living in the UK. Labour said, why no guarantees?
They and their families are not pawns in a game of poker with the EU. They cannot be used as a human shield as we battle it out in Europe for our UK citizens in other countries abroad.
I think, again, it would be completely wrong in terms of negotiating, in terms of our negotiating position, to declare unilaterally that all EU nationals up to a certain date can continue to live here without any fear or favour.
Another day, another issue. On Tuesday, MPs demanded that in 2 years' time, Parliament gets a decisive vote on the final exit agreement from the EU.
The central theme of the case I will seek to make this afternoon is that a vote in this House must be before the deal is concluded. That is the dividing line that makes the real difference here.
I can confirm that the government will bring forward a motion on the final agreement to be approved by both houses of Parliament before it's concluded, and we expect and intend that this will happen before the European Parliament debates and votes on the final agreement. I hope that's of assistance.
Ms Engel and Minister, I am very grateful for that intervention. That is a huge and very important concession.
If that deal comes to this House and we vote it down, and subsequently the Commission and the European Parliament agree it and say like it or lump it, what will we do then?
I would have thought, Ms Engels, that in the circumstance that this House had voted it down, it would be highly unlikely that it would ever be put to the European Parliament.
I think the point here is for this to be a meaningful concession. What the House wants is the opportunity to send the government back to our EU partners to negotiate a deal if one hasn't been reached. Going on to WTO rules, I say to the Minister, will be deeply damaging for our economy and wholly unacceptable.
I can see that we could end up with a situation where the agreement is 1 minute to midnight at the end of the 2-year period. And if the government doesn't then conclude an agreement to bring it to the House after, but before it goes to the European Parliament, we could end up with no deal at all.
You could imagine 2 years of travel, journey down that road of negotiation. We get to the edge of the canyon, and we have a point of decision. Are we going to have that bridge across the chasm, which might be the new treaty? It might take us to that new future. Or are we going to potentially decide to jump off into the unknown, into the abyss? And Parliament should have the right to decide that point.
So to Wednesday, and at Prime Minister's questions, the SNP asked, what about the views of the Scottish Parliament?
When the Prime Minister was in Edinburgh on the 15th of July last year, she pledged that she would, and I quote, not trigger Article 50 until she had an agreed UK-wide approach.
Wow. Correct.
Wow. So given that the Scottish Parliament has voted overwhelmingly against her approach, and all bar one MP representing a Scottish constituency in this House of Commons has voted against her approach, she does not have an agreed UK-wide approach. Now, Mr. Speaker, as the Prime Minister knows, a lot of people in Scotland watch Prime Minister's questions. So will she tell those viewers in Scotland whether she intends to keep her word to Scotland or not?
The Supreme Court was very clear that the Scottish Parliament does not have a veto on the triggering of Article 50. The bill that is going through the House, obviously, is giving the power to the government to trigger Article 50. And I would also remind him of this point, because he constantly refers to the interests of Scotland inside the European Union. An independent Scotland would not be in the European Union.
With all amendments voted down, the Brexit bill reached the end of the road in the Commons. But before the final vote, expressions of anger.
The government's refusal to accept a single amendment means there'll be no report stage. The programme motion means there's no debate on third reading. I'm informed by the Library that the last time that combination happened was the Defence of the Realm Act of 1914, which was about the First World War. For this to happen in any bill would be an abuse. To happen on this bill is an outrage. What is it about the procedures of this place that allow a bill of this constitutional significance to be railroaded through in this disgraceful fashion?
What I can say is that the House agreed to a programme motion, and that is what's been adhered to. Point of order, Jacob.
Mr. Deputy Speaker, this House has nobly represented the will of the British people in a referendum, and that is why it's passed as it has.
And so to the vote.
The question is that the bill now be read, as many of that opinion say aye. Aye! The contrary, no.
Division! Clear the lobbies!
In fact, the verdict was never in doubt. With most Labour MPs supporting the bill, there was a huge majority for the government.
The ayes to the right, 494. The noes to the left, 122.
52 Labour MPs had defied their whip and voted against the bill. That meant some resignations, most notably Clive Lewis from his job as Shadow Business Secretary. And a final footnote. The pro-European SNP MPs struck up a musical note in the chamber by way of protest, singing Beethoven's Ode to Joy, the European anthem. Until they were stopped.
Order! I don't want to sing off within the chamber. It's very good of you, much appreciated, but if you can just leave it for a little while. It's been very tense week already. I just don't need any extra. Thank you.
Lindsay Hoyle, the Deputy Speaker, bringing the Commons to order in his own way. It was quite a week for the Commons Speaker himself. A motion of no confidence was put down on Speaker John Bercow after he dramatically announced that he wouldn't want the US President Donald Trump to address Westminster Hall on his anticipated forthcoming state visit. The no confidence motion, tabled by a Tory backbencher, is not likely to be debated, but it does add to the pressures on Mr Bercow. Critics say, by speaking out, he's undermined the traditional neutrality of the Speaker's role. Gary Connor now reports.
Ever since it was announced that US President Donald Trump would come to the UK on a state visit this year, there's been a row brewing. Some state visits, such as those by Nelson Mandela, Pope Benedict and Barack Obama, have seen the leaders make a speech in Westminster Hall. But more than 200 MPs have signed an early day motion, a method for MPs to register their support for a cause, against President Trump visiting Westminster. And on Monday, the Speaker spoke out.
I wondered, Mr Speaker, whether you could tell us what approaches have been made to you and what conversations or discussions have taken place with the relevant authorities, the key holders for such an approach to go ahead, and whether or not there are ways in which those of us who have deep concerns about President Trump's comments could make that known to the responsible authorities.
Before the imposition of the migrant ban, I would myself have been strongly opposed to an address by President Trump in Westminster Hall. After the imposition of the migrant ban by President Trump, I am even more strongly opposed to an address by President Trump in Westminster Hall. As far as this place is concerned, I feel very strongly that our opposition to racism and to sexism and our support for equality before the law and an independent judiciary are hugely important considerations in the House of Commons.
But an address to Parliament isn't just at the discretion of Mr Bercow. His Lord's equivalent also has a say. And Lord Fowler said that he wasn't consulted.
Yesterday in the Commons, Mr Bercow said that he was opposed to the President speaking. I should make it clear that I was not consulted on that decision or its timing.
Although John Bercow received rapturous applause from the opposition benches, some on the government side, not always great fans of the Speaker, weren't so happy. So was the Speaker wrong to express a view shared by many MPs and members of the public?
There's nothing wrong with that if you're the Prime Minister. Possibly even if you're the monarch. You know, that is what certainly the leaders of the country are there to do. He's not the leader of the country, though. His job is to be a very independent arbiter of proceedings in the House of Commons.
And the Speaker was taken to task by certain sections of the press.
So he's been a very good Speaker, certainly for backbenchers, for journalists too, regularly, almost every day, certainly once, twice a week. He will call a minister to the House to answer an urgent question, which is great because that urgent question is almost always topical. When he does put his head above the parapet and goes a bit too far, as I think most people think he might have done this week, absolutely he's a target and absolutely newspapers are there to try and pull him down a peg or two. It's what we're quite good at.
So what impact might John Bercow's stand have on his future as Speaker?
I think John Bercow's future is going to be incredibly interesting, and this will play out this year. Of course, he said he's going to stand down in 2018. He said he'd served 9 years, and that was that. There is a lot of chat in the tea rooms amongst MPs on both sides in the last week, after the Trump furore, that actually he might have done this simply to put his cards down for re-election. Maybe he's thinking, actually, I'd rather enjoy this job as Speaker. I don't want to go next year. I'd like to stay on a few more years, and I would be able to do that if I have the support of Labour MPs. And what better thing to do to get that support than giving Donald Trump a fair, decent kicking?
Tom Newton-Dunn ending that report by Gary Connor. The people of Surrey were due to take part in a referendum in recent days, not on EU membership, but on whether they were happy to see a large 15% rise in their council tax to pay for the increasing costs of caring for elderly and vulnerable people. But the vote was called off. So what happened? At Prime Minister's questions, the Labour leader Jeremy Corbyn believed he knew why the vote and the 15% rise were abandoned.
Can the Prime Minister tell the House whether or not a special deal was done for Surrey?
I recognise the short-term pressures. That's why we have enabled local authorities to put more money into social care. We have provided more money. Over the next 2 years, 900 million more pounds will be available for social care.
Mr Speaker, my question was whether there had been a special deal done for Surrey. The leader said they'd had many conversations with the government. We know they have, because I've been leaked copies of texts sent by the Tory leader David Hodge, intended for somebody called Nick, who works for ministers in the Department of Communities and Local Government. And these texts read, I'm advised that DCLG officials have been working on a solution and you will be contacting me to agree a memorandum of understanding. Will the government now publish this memorandum of understanding.
What the Labour Party fails to understand is that this is not just a question of looking at money, it is a question of looking at spreading best practice and finding a sustainable solution. And I have to say to him that if we look at social care provision across the entire country, the last thing social care providers need is another one of Labour's bouncing cheques.
Mr. Speaker, I wonder if it's anything to do with the fact that the Chancellor and Health Secretary both represent Surrey constituencies. But, Mr. Speaker, there was a second text from Surrey County Council leader to Nick, and in the second text, it says the numbers you indicated are the numbers that I understand are acceptable for me to accept and call off the R. Now, I've been reading a bit of John le Carre, and apparently R means referendum. It's very subtle, all this. And he goes on to say in his text to Nick, if it is possible for that info to be sent to myself, I can then revert back soonest. Really want to kill this off. So how much did the government offer Surrey to kill this off? And is the same sweetheart deal on offer to every council facing the social care crisis created by her government?
Yet again, what we get from Labour are alternative facts. What they really need is an alternative leader. What he always fails to recognise, is that you can only spend money on social care and on the National Health Service if you have a strong economy to deliver the wealth that you need.
Theresa May displaying her leadership style in the Commons. Well, the leadership approach of Britain's recent Prime Ministers is the subject of a new series produced by BBC Parliament. The political journalist Steve Richards will be examining the careers of 6 former British Prime Ministers. His unscripted talks were recorded at Westminster. Here he considers David Cameron's decision to call the EU referendum.
I still think there was a case for doing it. I can certainly understand why he did it. Leaders sometimes are trapped. And when you have MPs defecting to UKIP and UKIP winning, as they did the European elections, topping that poll, you panic as a Prime Minister. And Cameron, he had already offered it by the time UKIP had won those European elections, thought he had no choice if he wanted to keep his party together but to hold it. But one of the lessons of leadership is this. Referendums are dangerous. They lure leaders towards them, thinking this is the way that they will be able to survive in politics. The referendum is their saviour. And when a leader actually announces one, it tends to clobber them and finish them off.
And the first of that series, Leadership Reflections, is on BBC Parliament at 8 o'clock on Sunday evening. Now a look at some of the other stories around Parliament in the last 7 days. Labour has described as shameful the government's decision to wind down a scheme allowing vulnerable refugee children into Britain. The Home Secretary, Amber Rudd, said the programme risked acting as an incentive for children to make perilous sea crossings to Europe. The Labour peer, whose name is associated with the scheme, voiced his disappointment.
I must confess I'm slightly puzzled, because if the government says there is a specified number of children, then after that total has been reached, the scheme has been closed. I believe in arbitrarily closing down a scheme without any good reason for doing so. The government is in breach of its own commitments.
At this point in time, the scheme is not closed. What I think, well, more children will come. The scheme is not closed. What I think we have to appreciate, and I think noble lords generally have appreciated, is that the capacity of local authorities is limited. Well, noble lords might rubbish that, but the capacity of local authorities is limited.
Are the banks ripping us off? Which magazine finds that customers who run up unauthorised overdrafts face charges sometimes 7 times higher than the cost of borrowing from a payday lender.
It is a disgrace that the banks are charging more than payday lenders for short-term lending and getting away with it. So the government should take action. The major banks currently make over £1 billion per year on charges on unauthorised overdrafts, the majority of whom, says the head of the Competition and Markets Authority, from financially vulnerable customers.
We've taken steps to encourage competition. We've taken steps to support credit unions. We've taken steps to improve financial education. And it's through this comprehensive approach that this government will continue to take steps to make sure British customers have quality choices.
An important tradition, or do they give Parliament the wrong image? The wigs worn by the clerks who sit in the Chamber of the Commons are to be phased out later this month. The Speaker finds himself in more controversy.
And it will, moreover, in my view, which I recognise may not be universally shared, convey to the public a marginally less stuffy and forbidding image of this chamber at work.
And I had declared informally that I thought that it was sensible to continue, because this, Mr. Speaker, is the High Court of Parliament. And I do think that the clerks, dressed as they are, add to the dignity of the House.
But the idea that this was something that I dreamt up and sought to impose against the will of the clerks is 100% wrong.
Will building new homes, both for owning and renting, provide the answer to England's broken housing market? The government announces ways to get more houses built, including making it harder to object to new developments.
And we will tackle unnecessary delays caused by everything from planning conditions to great-crested newts. There are young people right now in every one of our constituencies staring into the windows of estate agents, their faces glued to them, dreaming of renting or buying a decent home, but knowing that it's out of reach because prices have risen so high.
It is tragically clear, Mr. Speaker, from this statement that 7 years of failure on housing is set now to stretch to 10. We were promised a white paper. We're presented with a white flag.
They're definitely increasing, but are they also becoming more aggressive? The seagull problem and how to solve it occupies MPs' thoughts in Westminster Hall.
They breed and nest on the flat roofs of houses. They squabble with each other. They squawk incessantly at all hours of the day or night, creating a nasty racket. They bombard and soil windows.
We read stories about a diving seagull killing a pet dog. Things have become so bad and so widely publicised that our former Prime Minister, David Cameron, said that he wanted a big conversation about murderous seagulls.
And those juicy courgettes that we all miss so much. How long will the courgette crisis go on for after wintry weather in Europe left the shelves short of veg? A minister in the Lords reassures us things are not so bad.
But it is certainly no crisis. The only shortage will be of iceberg lettuce, which we think will be for about a few months, and there is a wonderful variety called Kos, which is even better.
Isn't it time that the government's forthcoming green paper on food and farming seeks to tackle this decline in homegrown veg?
Very much so. In fact, I was pleased only this morning to hear that cauliflowers from Cornwall are coming onto the market, so we have a great opportunity again to buy some British vegetables.
Lord Gardner. And finally, it's official. As we long suspected, the Prime Minister is a keen viewer of BBC Parliament. At PMQs, Theresa May told MPs how often she tunes in during the course of an evening. It all stemmed from a question put to her by an SNP MP about long-winded speeches.
Does she agree with me that the rules of the House should be changed to prevent filibustering and to ensure that members from all sides of the House get a fair share of the time available?
I have to say, I find that a rather curious question from the honourable gentleman. Last night, as it happens, I was out of the House between the two votes. I switched on the BBC Parliamentary channel and I saw the honourable gentleman speaking. I turned over to something else. I switched back. I switched back to the Parliamentary channel. I saw the honourable gentleman still speaking. I switched over to something else. I switched back and the honourable gentleman was still speaking. He's the last person to complain about filibustering in this House.
Theresa May, clearly a big channel hopper. But what was she switching over to? That's it for this programme. MPs and peers are now leaving Westminster for their half-term break. When they return, the House of Lords begins its debates on that Brexit bill. So do join us in a fortnight's time for the next week in Parliament. Until then, from me, Keith McDougall, goodbye.